This podcast is brought to you by Al Jazeera.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert. You're at The Listening Post. This week, Barack Obama and the U.S. media.
Let's face it, the easiest way to get on television right now is to be really rude.
Fair comment or racism in disguise. The Iran story still bubbling under in the blogosphere. What do the media in Argentina and Turkey have in common? Problems with the government and the taxman.
They hate our way of life.
And the stormtroopers from Star Wars and their take on America after 9/11.
Yeah, baby.
On last week's broadcast, we reported on the very public shouting match over President Barack Obama's healthcare reform proposals. However, the American media circus does not end there. The airwaves have been filled with allegations that Obama's a secret socialist, a Marxist, a Muslim, a foreigner even who has no legal right to be in the White House. And former President Jimmy Carter has said that much of the grist in the 24-hour news mill has its roots in racism. In the run-up to the UN and G20 meetings, Obama went on an interview blitz across the American news networks with a very specific message to those networks and their audiences. Our starting point this week is the U.S. president's beef with the 24-hour news cycle and the question of whether what's being said about Barack Obama on the air and in print is just politics or something that's more dangerous. President Obama and his message for the American news media.
The easiest way to get on CNN or Fox is to just say something rude and outrageous.
As the president tried to refute criticisms of his health care reform, a Republican congressman yelled out, "You lie."
The reforms I'm proposing would not apply to those who are here illegally.
They focus on the most extreme elements on both sides. They can't get enough of conflict.
Why did you bring a gun to a presidential event today?
If you're just being sensible and making your arguments, you don't get time on the nightly news.
The country's got big problems, yet what we have is a media that is largely concerned about whether or not Obama was legitimately born here in the United States.
He's chosen not to release his original birth certificate or a copy of it.
Talking about whether he's a socialist.
He has surrounded himself with Marxists his whole life.
Whether his administration is evocative of the Nazi regime.
Why do you continue to support a Nazi policy, as Obama has?
These outrageous assertions that are coming from purported news channels and purported news figures.
I think one reason the president has, gone out of his way to mention this is because what people are seeing on cable TV news, talk radio in particular, is really harming his ability to advance his agenda.
Let's face it, the easiest way to get on television right now is to be really rude.
We're not talking about, in the wake of the largest financial crisis in the Great Depression, we're talking about fictional death panels or the rise of fascism, Stalinism. We're talking about czars, all this idiotic nonsense.
And had a communist mentor.
It is hard to know where to start with this story. Take the recent 9/12 protests, the source of much anti-Obama name-calling. Does one begin with the event or with the media's coverage of the event?
This is, as best I can describe it, a absolute grassroots movement.
Because the media, in this case Fox News, helped make the event happen.
Do you want Washington to listen?
From the Tea Parties in April to the 9/12 protests, this insurgent movement has been fomented, publicized, advertised, given a platform by, and in that case, coordinated in a very kind of acute sense by Fox News. It's been a kind of cooperative undertaking from day one.
Guys, I'm very proud of the job that you have done. You should be very proud of yourselves. And to everyone there standing for freedom and liberty, God bless all of them. Thank you.
Now, I have no problem with people coming to protest. I think that's great. But to have a so-called news program being the emotional and the intellectual spearhead for that is just completely unconscionable.
Thousands are expected to participate in a march on Washington.
If it was just Fox, that would be one thing. But what Fox does affects other U.S. media. Red herring talking points in the healthcare debate, like death panels for the elderly, the specter of a government takeover, may get their start on Fox, but those fabrications then echo through other news outlets. Glenn Beck, the Fox News host who helped inspire the 9/12 protests, was the subject of a recent Time magazine cover story. Beck is famous for calling President Obama a racist who hates white people.
You know, whenever you have someone who's more about him or herself than truth, when that person becomes rewarded with the cover of a national news magazine, I don't know what we're saying.
In the article, Time said of the 9/12 protest in Washington, if you get your information from liberal sources, the crowd numbered 70,000. If you get your information from conservative sources, the crowd was perhaps as many as 1 million. Time got those two numbers right, but the sourcing was off the mark.
When you actually dig beneath the surface, you find out it wasn't the left saying 70,000 showed up, it was the Washington, D.C. Fire Department. So we've gotten to this point where somehow facts are now in dispute.
But it's not just how many people showed up to protest, it's what they are saying about America's first black president. When it comes to the rhetoric that has been aired,
President Obama is making the biggest power grab in American history.
And the potential dangers of it, there are two schools of thought. The first,
I think it's generally just stupid and overblown to compare people to Stalin and Hitler. I think it generally is self-negating as a sort of rhetorical and argumentative tactic. In terms of the danger of it, I'm not quite convinced that the rhetoric itself is dangerous.
And the second school of thought.
The danger is there that you inflame a certain fringe element that could do something dangerous. Instead of just walking around with a gun outside of a town hall, maybe the next Yahoo decides to shoot up a town hall.
On the day that Kennedy arrived in Dallas when he was killed in November 1963, November 22nd, there was a full-page ad in the local Dallas newspaper with a black border. It looked like it was a funeral. It said, "Welcome, Mr. Kennedy." It went on to accuse the president of being a communist tool. This type of hatred was quite present there, and I think helped incite people like Oswald. I think with that background, we should be especially aware in America that although dissent and skepticism is great, when the discourse gets too extreme, that it can encourage violent behavior, and that has to be the real warning for all of us and the wake-up call as well, so that it doesn't happen in the case of Barack Obama.
No one knows where the story of the Obama presidency is going, but we do know who is driving it. It's the 24-hour news channels, with all those hours to fill and plenty of angry voices with which to fill them.
I want to know if it's coming out of my paycheck.
How is this happening, and how is the mainstream media parroting it so often? How are we watching again, you know, in a country where we have a Democratic majority in Congress, a Democrat in the White House, where the right-wing media appears to still be setting so much of our popular and public agenda?
That is something President Obama might want to ask of the media people questioning him.
If you say something outrageous, you're there in a hot second.
Here's how our Global Village voices see the continuing battles that President Obama has on his hands with the American media.
I think that President Obama's assessment that the media thrives on extreme political comments is fair. And I believe that this happens because it's a pure monetary issue. People are incensed by extreme political comments and therefore are going to read more news publications, watch more news programs, and ultimately that means more money for the media.
The comparisons between Obama and Hitler and the rallies where you see them show that today's right-wing fringe has decided to be more like yesterday's left-wing fringe, which is weird because the left started winning when they toned down that 2004 era panic.
If you'd like to be one of our Global Village voices, you can email us at listeningpost@aljazeera.net, but most contributors just go on Facebook and find the Listening Post page there. We have more than 2,000 viewers signed up. You can also follow us through Twitter. We will let you know via Facebook and Twitter what stories we're working on and how you can get with the program. Time now for Listening Post News Bites. There's a multi-billion-dollar showdown underway in Turkey between the Erdogan government and the country's largest media conglomerate, Doğan Yayın. The company has been hit with a $2.5 billion fine for failing to pay taxes, but it says the fine is politically motivated. Doğan Yayın's holdings amount to about half of Turkey's media landscape. They include national top-selling newspapers, Hürriyet and Milliyet, as well as national TV outlets, Channel D, Star TV, and CNN Turk, which it owns in partnership with Time Warner. Earlier this year, Prime Minister Erdogan's Islamic government urged Turks to boycott the company's newspapers over their critical coverage. However, Erdogan denies the new fines have anything to do with that. The European Commission has condemned the fine and says the dispute and its impact on media freedom in Turkey could affect next month's progress report on Turkey's attempts to join the European Union. Last week, we told you about the Argentinian government going after that country's media giant, Grupo Clarín, ostensibly over overdue taxes. Now the Congress there has passed a new law that could lead to the dismantling of media conglomerates. The new legislation comes as the Argentinian president, Cristina Fernández, battles it out with Grupo Clarín, which has been critical of Fernández and her husband, the former president, Néstor Kirchner. The law would not affect newspapers, however, it would limit the number of cable companies and TV stations that conglomerates can own. The government says the law would provide diversification of media ownership. Critics argue the result will be more media outlets in the government's hands. Myanmar, which imprisoned journalists after the political protests back in 2007 and Cyclone Nargis in 2008, has released 2 of them as part of a prisoner amnesty program. Both A. Kai U and Jojo Tsa were jailed by the military government after their coverage of the cyclone. They got 2 and 7 years respectively for allegedly inciting hatred against the government. According to Agence France Presse, more than 7,000 prisoners were freed in the amnesty program. The number of political prisoners in Myanmar had doubled to more than 2,000 since the protests in 2007. Both reporters say they now plan to return to journalism. A few weeks back, we reported on the Israeli government's anger over a Swedish newspaper report that alleged that in the early 1990s, Israeli soldiers stole and then sold the organs of some dead Palestinian men. The paper that published that story, the Aftonbladet tabloid, has been cleared in the case by Sweden's Chancellor of Justice. The Chancellor, Göran Lamberts, looked into the complaint and chose not to open an investigation. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu demanded that the Swedish government condemn the newspaper for the report, but Sweden's Prime Minister Fredrik Reinfeldt refused. He said a free press is an integral part of Sweden's democracy. Rupert Murdoch is suing Italian Prime Minister and fellow media potentate Silvio Berlusconi. Murdoch's News Corp is taking 2 of Berlusconi's Mediaset firms to court, accusing them of refusing to allow Murdoch's Sky Italia satellite channel to advertise on Berlusconi's terrestrial network. News Corp is arguing that Mediaset is violating EU antitrust legislation as well as Italian competition laws. The Italian legal case might be harder to win since Berlusconi runs the government. Murdoch and Berlusconi used to get along, but recently they've been slugging it out over the Italian market. And Berlusconi has accused Murdoch of personal attacks against him in the Times of London, which printed a series of articles on Berlusconi's marital troubles. This Murdoch versus Berlusconi feud has a vague alien versus predator feel to it, in that, like the movie, viewers might have difficulty sympathizing with one character over the other. We're back after the break when we'll check in with the new media players in Iran to take the political temperature there. Welcome back. The contested June election in Iran galvanized hundreds of thousands of people to come out onto the streets to protest in the first outpouring of its scale since the Islamic Revolution. At the time, new media mechanisms such as Twitter and Facebook were given much of the credit for getting the news out. However, what happened next was a familiar story. Arrests and detentions of protesters and journalists, and accusations of torture and even rape were made against the security forces. We thought this would be a good time to take another look at Iran. The Listening Post's Simon Ostrovsky now on the citizen journalists desperately trying to keep their political movement alive, and some of the things the government in Tehran is doing to counter them to keep its hold on power.
It was supposed to be a Jerusalem day, like any other, when Iran shows its support for the Palestinian people by marching in the streets to condemn Israel. But after a long 3 months in which the authorities rounded up hundreds of people, subjecting many to brutal interrogations in the wake of elections protests, these were the scenes on the streets of Tehran. Their chanting, "Not for Gaza, not for Lebanon, we will die for Iran."
Ever since the June elections, Iranians around the world have been protesting the contested victory of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. But the surprising thing is that the protests have continued in Iran itself, and this wouldn't have been possible without social networking and the information provided by dedicated citizen journalists online.
Using the blogs, the website, maybe 20 million young people back home in different cities, and every one of them got their own story to tell.
Here, mobile phone footage taken by a citizen journalist and posted on YouTube shows a mob tearing down an official poster that reads, "Palestine, the element of unity, Israel, the common enemy." A proliferation of websites and blogs to which tens of thousands of ordinary Iranians contribute every day, and which millions read, have in a very short time subverted the Islamic Republic's formidable media monopoly and put the authorities on the back foot.
They have done a wonderful thing in informing people in a greater level than it would have happened, especially now without access to mainstream media, and with very few newspapers that we've had either have been closed down or have internalized the restraints so much.
Those who post controversial material on the internet know they run the risk of landing in Tehran's notorious Evin prison. According to the New York-based Committee to Protect Journalists, close to 30 journalists and bloggers now languish in Iranian prisons.
Anyone who is putting posts on his or her weblog is jeopardizing his or her life.
Especially who died for freedom.
Iman Nabavi is a photographer now blogging from the relative safety of London. He told me how Iranians, despite the dangers, have kept the online protest movement alive.
At this time, the bloggers in Iran is working very hard to get the news out, using the mobile phone, the normal compact camera maybe. And this is the best because there's no news agency at this time working perfectly over there. Most of the news agency working with the government.
Nowruznews.ir is an online newspaper run by a handful of dedicated Iranians working in secret, both inside and outside Iran. It conducted an investigation into rumors that the authorities were hiding bodies of demonstrators in a city cemetery and posted this chilling footage of pre-dug graves. The pictures caused so much outrage that the government felt it had to react, producing reports like this one to decry the video as a fake and part of a Western smear campaign.
افرادی که از سوی مراجع قانونی و پزشکی قانونی منظورم هست اینا هویتشون مشخص نیست برای اونها و در اثر حوادث فوت شدن، تصادف یا کارتون خواب هستن یا اعتیاد داشتن یا
The government has taken the threat of publications on the internet so seriously, it's prosecuted online activists publicly in show trials.
مسئول آیتی کمیته اطلاع رسانی و تبلیغات ستاد انتخاباتی میم بوده است و بعد از انتخابات فعالیت‌های گسترده اینترنتی را به منظور به جریان انداختن اغتشاشات انجام داده است.
And televised confessions.
خواسته وارد سناریو سازی های راهبران اصلی این اغتشاشات برای اشاعه انقلاب مخملین با توسعه شایعه مخدوش بودن انتخابات که در نتیجه آن زیر سوال بردن نظام شده بودیم.
Miriam Elia is a comedienne who's campaigning for the release of her friend, Hangame Shahidi, one of the many journalists arrested since the election.
I know that she's been arrested without any trial. I know that she's been tortured, and some of the worst forms of psychological torture called false executions, where you tell people that an order has been passed and they're going to die, and she's been led out and put to the gallows, and they've put, the rope around her neck and then called off the execution at the last minute. It's a way of obtaining a false confession.
Despite having control of all of the country's traditional media, ever since June, the Iranian government has been fighting to sell its side of the story to its own people. Even the most non-political events have become politically charged. A football stadium filled with fans wearing the opposition's green color, chanting anti-government slogans. So what did this state-run broadcaster do? It aired the pictures in black and white and turned off the sound.
واقعا عذرخواهی میکنیم. من دیگه هیچ کاری به جز عذرخواهی نمیتونم بکنم، چون واقعا خودتونم تصاویر رو میبینید. بعضا من شرمنده شما هم به حال بازی.
That's the official Iran, in black and white. The image the government wants to project is of a legitimate president, a statesman for his country. The reality is that at home, the authorities are being challenged by hundreds and maybe thousands of citizen journalists whose reporting, accurate or not, is spreading across the country and around the World Wide Web.
More Global Village Voices now on Iran and the post-election media.
We have podcasts, we have videos on YouTube, we have stories coming out of Iran, and for people who can read Persian, there are many blogs to read, and many of them are getting translated as well. So there are so many sources of information now, and not all of the pressure is on the mainstream media to do the reporting.
Finally, sometimes it takes a fictional narrative to make some pertinent points about the non-fictional world. There's an American website called collegehumor.com, which recently used some Star Wars characters to mark the 8th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks on New York and Washington. Now, that doesn't sound on the surface like it would work, but substitute the Death Star for the Twin Towers, some stormtroopers for U.S. soldiers, and throw in a conspiracy theory or two, and it all makes a strange kind of sense. We've made this bar scene our web video of the week, and we'll see you next time at the Listening Post.
You know, I don't want to be a downer, but you guys do know what tomorrow is.
What's tomorrow?
Anniversary of the Death Star.
The Death Star?
Bingo.
Oh, yeah. Oh, my God. It's been a year already.
You guys remember where you were when it happened?
Yeah, I remember I was in Coruscant in training, waiting to hear some friends made it out. And, of course, they didn't because, well...
It blew up, evaporated.
Yeah, like a big, colorful firecracker. No one was getting out of there.
And you look at that part of the galaxy where the Death Star used to be, and it's just... nothing.
Yeah, still waiting on that memorial. Right now it's just a space garden.
Oh, the space garden,
I hear they're gonna build a new one, though. It's gonna be almost as big.
Yeah, 8 times as big.
8 times as big. Haven't we learned anything?
Look,
I mean,
if you don't rebuild, the Jedis win.
Jedis. I'll tell you something. They hate our way of life. Now, just because someone believes in the Force doesn't mean they're gonna go blow up a space station, all right? Yeah, maybe. Listen, we have all of this technology. Right? We can't find Luke Skywalker. One guy,
got a point.
hiding out in a cave somewhere in Dagobah.
You know, honestly, I just think Palpatine knew all along. And he let it happen just to justify going to Hoth.
Oh, here we go.
No, I'm serious. What? Darth Vader happens to be in a TIE fighter when the whole thing goes down? Please.